There is a peculiar type of fear that rarely announces itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as panic. It doesn't come with drama. It sneaks in quietly, often on an ordinary afternoon, while you're doing something completely forgettable. You're driving, washing dishes, scrolling, waiting. And then, without warning, a strange thought surfaces. Where did my life go? Not in a poetic way, not as nostalgia, but as a genuine disturbance, as if time had slipped past you while you were somehow distracted. Because subjectively, it doesn't feel like decades have passed. Internally, you still feel continuous, familiar, essentially the same person. Yet reality disagrees, the mirror disagrees. Your memories disagree. Your body, your circumstances, your past decisions, they all stand. They're like silent evidence that something irreversible has happened. Time moved, relentlessly, indifferently, without asking for your consent. What makes this realization so unsettling is not simply aging itself. Humans have always aged. Everyone knows this intellectually. The discomfort comes from something else, from the mismatch between psychological time and chronological time. Your mind does not experience life as a neat sequence of years. It experiences patterns, routines, repeated days, familiar environments. The brain compresses the predictable and stretches the novel, which means that large portions of life, sometimes entire years, can feel as if they barely existed at all. Not because they were short, but because they were indistinguishable. And when the mind looks back and finds mostly blur instead of texture, it generates a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. What exactly have I been doing with my existence? This is the quiet terror hidden inside the question. Not regret exactly, not sadness necessarily, but a vague, disorienting sense that life may have been happening without fully feeling like it was being lived. Human beings have a curious relationship with repetition. On one hand, the brain loves it. Predictability is metabolically cheap. Familiar routines require less cognitive effort, less uncertainty, less stress. The nervous system relaxes when tomorrow looks like today. On the other hand, repetition has a psychological side effect that almost no one considers while living inside it. It erases the sensation of time. When experiences become too similar, the brain stops recording them with detail. Days collapse into each other. Weeks lose edges. Months feel like administrative units rather than lived realities. This is not a failure of memory. It is an efficiency mechanism. Why waste neural resources documenting what appears to be the same day over and over? So the mind compresses, it smooths, it condenses vast stretches of life into something that, retrospectively, feels strangely thin. Ironically, the very structures that make life feel stable, steady job, familiar home, consistent schedule, are often the same structures that make years seem to vanish. Comfort has a hidden cost. Not physical comfort, temporal comfort. A life that feels safe and controlled in the present can feel shockingly short in hindsight. And this is where the first layer of existential discomfort appears. Because the person did not consciously choose to lose time. They were being responsible, sensible, practical, doing what adults are supposed to do. Yet decades later, the emotional verdict can feel brutal. I was busy, but with what? The brain, indifferent to social definitions of success, evaluates experience differently. It asks, was it varied? Was it novel? Was it emotionally distinct? If not, the subjective length of life contracts. This is why childhood summers feel endless, while adult years accelerate into something almost absurd. The environment stops changing, so time appears to accelerate, not in physics, but in perception. And perception is the only timeline the mind actually inhabits. There is another psychological element that makes the "where did my life go?" moment particularly disturbing. Identity continuity. Most people assume they are constantly evolving, but subjectively, the sense of self feels surprisingly stable. Internally, you still feel like you, even as external markers shift dramatically. The brain maintains a narrative illusion of consistency. You remember being younger, but you do not feel like a different entity. It feels more like the same consciousness moving through changing scenery. Until one day, reality introduces a rude interruption. Photos, old messages, forgotten ambitions, abandoned versions of yourself. Suddenly, you confront evidence that previous identities did, in fact, exist, and many of them are gone. Not temporarily paused, gone. Dreams once considered essential now seem irrelevant. Fears once paralyzing now feel trivial. People once central have vanished from your daily life. Entire psychological worlds have dissolved. Yet during the transition, it rarely felt dramatic. Life did not announce, "Attention. A chapter of your existence is ending forever." It simply drifted, which creates a peculiar retrospective shock. You do not feel like someone who has lived many lives. You feel like someone who has been the same person for a long time, inside a reality that kept mutating without clearly informing you. This produces a strange cognitive tension. If I still feel like myself, how can so much of my life already be unreachable? How can entire decades feel both close and impossibly distant? The mind struggles with this because human intuition is poorly equipped for long-term temporal awareness. We are built for immediate survival, not for gracefully comprehending the irreversible disappearance of years. Regret plays a subtler role in this psychological landscape than most people imagine. The discomfort is rarely about spectacular mistakes. It is more often about invisible drift. Lives are not typically derailed by single catastrophic decisions. They are shaped by thousands of small defaults, paths of least resistance, socially reinforced expectations, delayed choices that quietly become permanent. No dramatic rebellion, no decisive turning point, just gradual adaptation. Humans are extraordinarily good at normalizing their circumstances. What once felt temporary becomes how things are. What once felt negotiable becomes reality, and the brain, prioritizing stability, cooperates. It reduces internal friction. It reframes compromises as preferences. Years later, when reflection interrupts this adaptive trance, the realization can feel jarring. I didn't exactly choose this life. I slowly ended up here. This is not tragedy. It is typical human psychology. But typical does not mean emotionally comfortable, because once the perception of lost time emerges, the mind performs a cruel reconstruction exercise. Alternative paths appear vividly plausible. Different careers, different risks, different relationships, different versions of the self that now exist only as ghost scenarios. Not guaranteed better lives, but undeniably different ones. The pain is not certainty of failure. It is awareness of irreversibility. Time did not just pass. Options closed, silently, efficiently, without ceremony. And yet, the most unsettling aspect of the "where did my life go?" question may be this. Life did not actually go anywhere. It was experienced, felt, lived in real time, even if it now feels compressed, blurred, or strangely distant. The mind's discomfort arises not because existence vanished, but because memory and perception refuse to preserve it in the way intuition expects. We imagine life as something solid and accumulative, but psychologically, it behaves more like a dissolving sequence of present moments, each one immediately replaced, rarely stored with the weight we assign to it later. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is not that time moves fast. It is that consciousness only ever inhabits now, while meaning is assigned retrospectively. By the time a decade feels significant, it is already inaccessible. By the time a phase of life is understood, it has already ended. Which leaves humans in a peculiar position, always inside the present, always haunted by the past, always negotiating with a future that never arrives as anything other than another present moment. Perhaps the question, "where did my life go?" is less a complaint about time, and more a confrontation with the fundamental structure of human experience itself. Nothing was stolen. Nothing accelerated unnaturally. This is simply what it feels like to be a conscious organism moving through irreversible time, quietly, continuously, until one ordinary afternoon when the mind briefly steps outside the routine and notices the distance.